Good afternoon, I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we're going to continue our poetry, prose and riddles stream. So, to start with the poetry, we had just finished the selection of poems by Lord Byron in this anthology last week. So we will begin by looking at the last poem that we read. And that was a song from Don Juan. Don Juan, I believe, being a larger poetical work, and this being one part of it. The Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung, where grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phobos sprung. Eternal summer gilds them yet, but all except their sun is set. The Scion and the Teian muse, the hero's harp, the lover's lute, have found the fame your shores refuse. Their place of birth alone is mute to sounds which echo further west than your sire's islands of the blest. The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. And musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free, for standing on the Persian's grave, I could not deem myself a slave. A king sate on the rocky brow, which looks o'er sea-born Salamis, and ships by thousands lay below, and men in nations, all were his. He counted them at break of day, and when the sun set, where were they? And where are they? And where art thou? My country, on thy voiceless shore, the heroic lay is tuneless now, the heroic bosom beats no more, and must thy lyres so long divine degenerate into hands like mine? 'Tis something in the dearth of fame, though linked among a fettered race, to feel at least a patriot's shame, even as I sing suffuse my face, for what is left the poets here, for Greeks a blush, for Greece a tear. Must we but weep o'er days more blessed? Must we but blush our fathers bled? Earth, render back from out thy breast a remnant of Spartan dead. Of the 300 grant but 3 to make a new Thermopylae. What? Silent still and silent all? Ah, no, the voice of the dead sounds like a distant torrent's fall, and answer, let one living head, but one arise, we come, 'tis but the living who are dumb. In vain, strike other chords, fill high the cup with Samian wine, leave battles to the Turkish hordes, and shed the blood of Scio's vine. Hark, rising to the ignoble call, how answers each bold bacchanal. You have the Pyrrhic dancers yet, where is the Pyrrhic phalanx gone? Of the two such lessons why forget the nobler and the manlier one? You have the letters of Cadmus gave, think ye he meant them for a slave? Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, we will not think of fiends like these. It made Anacreon's song divine, he served Polycrates, a tyrant, but our masters then was still at least our countryman. The tyrant of the Chersonese was freedom's best and bravest friend, that tyrant was Miltiades. Oh, that the present hour would lend another despot of the kind, such chains as his were sure to bind. fill high the bowl with Samian wine. On Sully's rock and Parga's shore exists the remnant of a line, such as a Doric mother's bore, and there perhaps some seed is sown, the Heraclidian blood my own. 'Twas not for the freedom to the Franks, they have a king who buys and sells, in native swords and native ranks, the only hope of courage dwells, but Turkish force and Latin fraud would break your shield however broad. Fill high the bowl with Samian wine, our virgins dance beneath the shade, I see their glorious black eyes shine, but gazing on each glowing maid, my own the burning tear drop laves, to think such breasts must suckle slaves. Place me on Sunumian's marbled steep, where nothing save the waves and I may hear our mutual murmurs sweep. There, swan-like, let me sing and die. A land of slaves shall never be mine. Dash down yon cup of Samian wine. I'm fine, Jenny. Thank you for your concern. So that was a song from Don Juan. Clearly it is about the then servitude of Greece to the Ottoman Empire. And as we know that Lord Byron died in the War of Greek Independence, clearly this was something that was on the author's mind. Still, I think it's very nice for what it is. Essentially a call to arms in poetic form. So that's the poem we finished last week, and I think may have actually been the only poem we went through because it's quite a long one. And we are about to start on the poems in this anthology by Thomas Campbell. Wikipedia has this to say about him. He was born in 1777 and died in 1844. That means he was born a Georgian and died a Victorian, so he spans those periods. He was a Scottish poet. He was founder and first president of the Clarence Club and a co-founder of the Literary Association of the Friends of Poland. He was also one of the initiators of a plan to found what became University College London. In 1799 he wrote The Pleasures of Hope, a traditional 18th century didactic poem in heroic couplets. He also produced several patriotic war songs, Ye Mariners of England, The Soldier's Dream, Hohenlinden, and in 1801 The Battle of the Baltic, but was no less at home in delicate lyrics such as At Love's Beginning. I won't bother to read the rest of the page. That gives us a sense, I should think, of who he was. Enough that hopefully we'll be able to glean more from his poetry. And the first poem indeed is Hohenlinden. I'm not entirely sure how that's supposed to be pronounced, I must say. I can't help but wonder if some of that is in a Scottish dialect. Still, moving on to the first reading. On Linden when the sun was low, all bloodless lay the untrodden snow, and dark as winter was the flow of Issa rolling rapidly. But Linden saw another sight, when the drum beat at dead of night, commanding fires of death to light the darkness of her scenery. By torch and trumpet fast arrayed, each horseman drew his battle blade, and furious every charger neighed, to join the dreadful revelry. They shook the hills with thunder riven, then rushed the steed to battle driven, and louder than the bolts of heaven, for flashed the red artillery. But redder yet that light shall glow on Linton's hill of stained snow, and bloodier yet the torrent flow of Issa rolling rapidly. 'Tis morn, but scarce yon level sun can pierce the war clouds rolling dun, where furious Frank and fiery Hun shout in their sulphurous canopy. The combat deepens on ye brave, who rush to glory on the grave. Wave Munich all thy banners wave, and charge with all thy chivalry. Few shall part where many meet, the snow shall be their winding sheet, and every turf beneath their feet shall be a soldier's sepulchre. I'm going to have to double check how that word's pronounced. I know it's obviously related to sepulchral, so to do with a grave. Hello, Saint Just Germany. Sepulchre. So, I would suggest it's also worth looking up what the linden is that's being referred to in this. Could be many places, so perhaps it would make more sense to look up this poem. Jenny asked Saint Just Germany, what do you usually read? And they replied, I grew up with some fancy novels, recently more non-fiction stuff, but I have a poem I really like. What's that then, if you don't mind my asking? Yes, you may put the poem in chat. Hohenlinden, meaning high linden trees, colloquially linden, in the Bavarian dialect, is a community in the upper Bavarian district of Ebersberg. The city of Linden, Washington, is named after it. Presumably the poem refers to the Battle of Hohenlinden. Saint has just put the poem they like into chat. I'll read it out, but do you mind if I ask who wrote it? Anyway, the poem is that Saint has put into chat is, the brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, a syllable from sound. Emily Dickinson. I've heard of her, but I must admit I'm not all that familiar. 1830 to 1886, was an American poet, little known during her life. She has since been regarded as one of the most important figures in American poetry. Interesting. Saint just said, I found the poem in a book by Marvin Minsky, if I remember correctly. I'm not familiar with that author, but I could believe it. It's an interesting poem. It's notable that by that point they had clearly made the brain-mind link. I'm not 100% sure when that link was properly established, but obviously they seem fully aware at that point that the centre of consciousness is the brain. It's also notable in the line about the brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound and they will differ if they do a syllable from sound, as I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that what is being put forward there is that it's the divine spark which is responsible for consciousness, which is centred in the brain. Therefore the brain and God are not so dissimilar, are they? Which is an interesting perspective, an interesting way of looking at things. And it's got a simple rhyming scheme. Of course, with the way it's laid out there, I can't see where the lines are supposed to be broken, but I think it's a sort of A, B, C, B, where A and B are, where A and C could be anything, but that the second and the fourth lines in each paragraph have to rhyme. Yeah, I like it. It's not, that's not a poet I know much about, but very interesting. Right, Battle of Hohenlinden. Let's work out what this poem is actually about. So it was fought on the 3rd of December 1800 during the French Revolutionary Wars. A French army under Jean-Victor Marie Moreau won a decisive victory over an Austrian and Bavarian force led by Archduke John of Austria. The Allies were forced into a disastrous retreat that compelled them to request an armistice, effectively ending the war of the Second Coalition. Hohenlinden, da 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 da. The subsequent Treaty of Amiens between France and Britain began the longest break in the wars of the Napoleonic period. Interesting. The battle is the subject of a poem, Hohenlinden, by Thomas Campbell. The first verse is, we've read that. The American cities, Linden, Alabama, da da da. Is this going to take us to an article about the poem specifically? No, it's going to take us to a copy of it. So that's interesting, because it seems to be a patriotic poem, but I'm not sure why a Scottish author would be speaking highly of French victories. So, I'll read it. Hold on, I didn't figure out what Issa is, did I? That also seems important. Possibly this one, Issa? Looks like it. So it's a river. A river that is nearby, it would seem. So, I'll read it a second time and see if it makes any more sense. On Linden when the sun was low, all bloodless lay the untrodden snow, and dark as winter was the flow of Issa rolling rapidly. But Linden saw another sight, when the drum beat at dead of night, commanding fires of death to light the darkness of her scenery. By torch and trumpet fast arrayed, each horseman drew his battle blade, and furious every charger neighed to join the dreadful revelry. Then shook the hills with thunder riven, then rushed the steed to battle driven, and louder than the bolts of heaven, far flashed the red artillery. But redder yet that light shall glow on Linton's hill of stained snow, and bloodier yet the torrent flow of Issa rolling rapidly. 'Tis morn, but scarce yon level sun can pierce the war clouds rolling dun, where furious Frank and fiery Hun shout in their sulphurous canopy. The combat deepens. On, ye brave, who rush to glory or the grave, wave, Munich, all thy banners wave, and charge with all thy chivalry. Few shall part where many meet, the snow shall be their winding sheet, and every turf beneath their feet shall be a soldier's sepulchre. This one also has an interesting rhyming scheme. Because it seems to be an A, B. And then the B's don't have to rhyme between paragraphs, but often they're a half rhyme. Rapidly, scenery, revelry, artillery, rapidly, canopy, chivalry, sepulchre. So it's still, there's still a what's the word? There's still an ear for sound there. There's still, even though it's not quite a rhyme in all cases, it's going to have a certain effect. And having read through the poems so far in this anthology, it's very unusual, I think, to have just the first 3 lines of a 4-line paragraph rhyming. I suppose I should now check to see if there's any sort of meter, although I doubt it. Okay, most lines appear to be 8 syllables. So that raises the possibility that there could be a meter here, because clearly if there was no pattern to the number of syllables on a line, you couldn't have a meter. So, is there actually a meter? Doesn't look like it. If there is a meter here, I would suggest that it must be iambic. So a weak beat followed by a strong beat, and it would be in sets of 4. So that's I don't remember what that would be called. What would that be called? Would that be iambic tetrameter? Yes, I think it would. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. Oh, wait. No, that can't be right. Yeah. Da-dun, 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 da-dun. Come live with me and be my love. So that would be iambic tetrameter. That's the only meter here that would make sense, but I'm very doubtful because it would lead to some odd intonation. So, all bloodless lay the untrodden snow. No, that can't be right. I should be ending on a strong beat, shouldn't I? Oh, this was the one line where I found 9 syllables, wasn't it? Which also contradicts that. Although it's possible that part of this isn't supposed to be pronounced. There could be some disappearing syllables there that I'm not spotting. But on Issa rolling rapidly. It just sounds odd. Rapidly. Doesn't sound right. So I'm guessing there isn't a meter here. But it is moderately consistent in there being 8 syllables per line. So I think that's all I can say about this one. It seems fairly straightforward. Looks to be just generally glorifying war. I don't really have enough knowledge about the history to pin it down more than that, but I don't see anything here which seems more specific or politically motivated other than just describing war in heroic terms. And we have a understanding of what's going on poetically in terms of both the both any rhyming and the rhythm. So, is there anything else we'd like to discuss about this poem before we move on? In fact, I'll give it one last reading, then I'll check chat to see if there's anything else that we want to discuss about this one, and then at that point once anything to be discussed has been discussed, we'll move on to the next poem. So, on Linton when the sun was low, all bloodless lay the untrodden snow, and dark as winter was the flow of Issa rolling rapidly. But Linton saw another sight, when the drum beat at dead of night, commanding fires of death to light the darkness of her scenery. By torch and trumpet fast arrayed, each horseman drew his battle blade, and furious every charger neighed, to join the dreadful revelry, and shook the hills with thunder rhythm. Then rushed the steed to battle driven, and louder than bolts of heaven, far flashed the red artillery. But redder yet that light shall glow on Linton's hills of stained snow, and bloodier yet the torrent flow of Issa rolling rapidly. 'Tis morn, but scarce yon level sun can pierce war clouds rolling dun, where furious Frank and fiery Hun shelter in their sulphurous canopy. The combat deepens on you brave, who rush to glory o'er the grave. Wave Munich, all thy banners wave, and charge with all thy chivalry. Few, few shall part where many meet, the snow shall be their winding sheet, and every turf beneath their feet shall be a soldier's sepulchre. Saint just asked me my profession. Currently I am a carer for my mother. So is there anything else to discuss about this one, do you think, or shall we move on? Oh, that was the only poem by Thomas Campbell, it would appear, in this anthology. Okay, I'll assume then there isn't anything more to discuss about that one. So the next poem is by Arthur Hugh Clow. I may be mispronouncing that. It looks like it should be Kloof. So he was born 1819 and he died 1861. So that would make him... yes, that... I think 1819 may have been the year Victoria took to the throne, actually. So he would have been born a Georgian. Yes, in May. So just barely, by a matter of months, he was born a Georgian, but he spent most of his life a Victorian, it would appear. He was an English poet, an educationalist, and devoted assistant to Florence Nightingale. Now that's interesting. He was brother of suffragist Anne Kloof and father of Blanche Athena Kloof, who both became principals of Newnham College, Cambridge. Interesting. He was born in Liverpool to James Butler Kloof, a cotton merchant of Welsh descent, and Anne Perfect from Pontefract in Yorkshire. well, we don't need to go into all the details, but we have an idea about his background, what he did in life, and when he was about. So this poem is called Say Not the Struggle Naught Availeth. I think that means don't say that the struggle isn't worth it. I am going to double check what availeth is though. To turn to the advantage of, obviously from avail. So yes, I think that is saying, don't say that the struggle isn't worth it. So, the first reading. Say not the struggle naught availeth, the labour and the wounds are vain, the enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been they remain. If hopes were dupes, fears may be liars, it may be in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and but for you possess the field. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful itch to gain, far back through creeks and inlets making, comes silent flooding in the main. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light, in front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. Well, I understood some of that. Is that the... Yep, that's the end of the poem, and that's the only poem by Arthur Hugh Clough, it would appear, in this anthology. So we've got a classic ABAB rhyming scheme. Yes, I can't see any consistent number of syllables per line, although they're hovering around 8 or 9 syllables per line. But if the number of syllables isn't even consistent or following some sort of pattern, then that would rule out a meter, as I understand meter. I'm not an expert in this matter, sadly. So, back to the meaning. I'll probably read it through again slowly and try and look at each line more carefully. Say not the struggle naught availeth, the labour and the wounds are vain. The enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been they remain. Okay, so I think that say not at the top, is supposed to apply to all that follows in that paragraph. So say not, the struggle naught availeth. Say not, the labour and the wounds are vain. Say not, the enemy faints nor faileth. Say not, as things have been they remain. So the first paragraph just seems to be a general statement of don't be defeatist, although with specific examples of what that thinking might be. So, if hopes were dupes, fears may be liars. Right, what do they mean by a dupe in this context? A person who's been deceived. See, that's what I immediately, what immediately jumps to mind. It's not going to be a duplicate. That probably is it then. So if hopes were dupes, if hopes were deceived, fears may be liars. Not sure I fully follow that. I mean, I assume if fears may be liars is saying the things that you fear may not be worth being scared about whatsoever. But it's if hopes were dupes part that I'm not quite following. It may be in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and but for you possess the field. Okay, so this is about war, or at least there's very strong war themes. So, during this period, battlefields would have been very smoky due to the artillery of the period. And so they're saying, even though you can't see the smoke, you don't know that your comrades aren't chasing down the enemy that are fleeing. And the final line, and but for you possess the field. And it's only because of you that they still possess the field. Because you're still on the field holding it while they are chasing people down. I think that's what it's saying. Ah, so I wonder if the first line, if hopes were dupes, fears may be liars, is sort of a comparison saying, yes, it's possible that the things you are hoping for aren't entirely... the things you hope for are not actually the case, you have been deceived, but equally the things that you may be afraid of may also not be true. I think that might be what the first line in the second paragraph is saying. Saint just asked me whether my mother needs a lot of help. It's one of those situations where her mobility is limited, so it's very helpful for her to have someone around that can help her do things which she otherwise couldn't do. So my presence is very useful. So, third paragraph. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain. Far back through creeks and inlets making, comes silent flooding in the main. I'm not sure I follow that one. I have a theory for what that could mean, but I'm not confident about it. For while the tired waves vainly breaking seem here no painful inch to gain, I think it might literally be talking about battling up to some body of water, and the point being that it seems that there's nowhere else you can advance further to, maybe? Which seems a bit odd. Far back through creeks and inlets making comes silent flooding in the main. That could be a reference to there being troops further back. So perhaps the troops that had previously been talked about that had gone after those that had fled, perhaps they're on the other side of a river, for example, and they'll come flooding back. The main body of your force, maybe? I'm not confident about that. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure what they mean in the third paragraph, but that's the best I can think of. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. Nope, I don't get it. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. Well, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, so I suppose if you had a window to a house that was eastwards, then you would see the sun rising. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. Unless that's metaphorically a reference to the brightness of the West in terms of being, culturally and technologically advanced, as they would have seen it back then. I'm not sure what they're getting at. Apologies, this has been one of the more difficult poems for me thus far. Still, we've looked at the rhythm and the rhyme of this poem, and we've certainly figured out some of the meaning. Certainly, where at first it seemed to be more of a general "don't give up," this now seems to be more clearly about battle, and be brave, keep fighting on. You don't know what's happening outside of your view. So I will probably have to so unless there's something else anyone else wants to raise or talk about regarding this one, I will probably make this my final reading and then move on. Say not the struggle naught availeth, the labour and the wounds are vain, the enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been they remain. If hopes were dupes, fears may be liars, it may be, in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and but for you possess the field. For while the tired waves vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back through creeks and inlets making, comes silent flooding in the main. and not by eastern windows only. When daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to take a very quick break now to move some plants indoors, because it's just started raining. So, I will be back in about 5 minutes, and at that point we will either look at another poem or move on to Pride and Prejudice, depending upon what the time is. Sorry about this, and I will be back shortly. Oh, my apologies about that. I'm back again. I'm thinking we will try one more poem and then move on to Pride and Prejudice. So, we've moved on to poems by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Yeah, I got a little wet, but never mind. In the rain. So, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. So he was predominantly Georgian, though he obviously died in the Victorian era. He was an English poet, literary critic, philosopher and theologian who, with his friend William Wordsworth, was founder of the Romantic movement in England and a member of the Lake Poets. He also shared volumes and collaborated with Charles Lamb, Robert Southey and Charles Lloyd. He wrote the poems The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan, as well as the major prose work Biographia Literaria. His critical work, especially on William Shakespeare, was highly influential, and he helped introduce German idealist philosophy to English-speaking cultures. Coleridge coined many familiar words and phrases, including suspension of disbelief. He had a major influence on Ralph Waldo Emerson and American Transcendentalism. Interesting. I feel like I've read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner before, probably at school. As for Kubla Khan, that sounds very familiar. Was that a relative of Genghis Khan? I think it was. I think it might have been a brother. Anyway, we now know who he is, if we didn't before. And this poem is called Youth and Age. Verse: a breeze mid blossoms straying, where hope clung feeding like a bee, both were mine, life went a maying, with nature, hope and posy, when I was young. When I was young, ah, woeful when. Ah, for the change twixt now and then. This breathing house not built with hands, this body that does me grievous wrong. O airy cliffs and glittering sands, how lightly when it flashed along, like those trim skiffs unknown of yore, on winding lakes and rivers wide, that ask no aid of sail or oar, that fear no spite of wind or tide, not cared this body for wind or weather, when youth and I lived in it together. Flowers are lovely, love is flower-like, friendship is a sheltering tree. Oh, the joys that came down shower-like, of friendship, love and liberty, ere I was old. Ere I was old? Ah, woeful ere, which tells me, youth's no longer here. O youth, for years so many and sweet, 'tis known that thou and I were one. I'll think it but a fond conceit, it cannot be that thou art gone. Thy vesper bell hath not yet tolled, and thou were I a masker hold. What strange disguise hast now put on, to make believe that thou art gone? I see these locks in silvery slips, this drooping gait, this altered size, but springtide blossoms on thy lips, and years take sunshine from thine eyes. Life is but thought, so think I will, that youth and I are housemates still. Dewdrops are the gems of morning, but the tears of mournful eve. Where no hope is, life's a warning, that only serves to make us grieve, when we are old. that only serves to make us grieve, which often tedious taking leave, like some poor, nigh-related guest, that may not rudely be dismissed, yet have outstayed his welcome while, and tells the jest without the smile. So this certainly has a very interesting form. Most of the poems we've looked at before have been quite regular. Whereas this is anything but regular. So we have, for example, a rhyme between straying and maying, but then we have bee, posy and young, which don't rhyme at all. And here we have when and then, hands and sands, wrong, along, your oar, wide tide, weather together, like, tree, liberty, and old at the end. And it just keeps alternating between a line and the next rhyming, or a line and or an ABAB type rhyme. It seems that the final line in the first 3 paragraphs is shorter than the rest and doesn't rhyme. I'm gonna double check that posy does mean the flower, as I think. No, it doesn't. I've been mistaken, haven't I? So it wasn't posy. How is that pronounced? That's poesy, I think. My IPA is not very good, unfortunately. It must be poesy. And that refers to either a poem or the class of literature comprising poems. Interesting. Yep, so that's on me. It should be poesy. I'm going to double check there's woeful as well, because I thought woeful like that would be spelt with an E, but now I'm wondering if it's a different word. No, it is in fact woeful. I must say, aside from the final lines, which all seem to be 4 syllables in the first 3 paragraphs, he seems to be doing a commendable job of sticking to 8 syllables per line. But not exclusively. This is 9. At least 9, could be 10. O'er airy cliffs and glittering sands. Depends whether you're saying glittering or glittering. Vesper Bell. What would Vesper Bell be? Oh, it refers to the evening. And I think we can rule out a meter just because of tells me. Because tells and me should both, following normal English pronunciation rules, should both be stressed. One being the main verb of the sentence and the other being the object. And you wouldn't get two stressed syllables like that next to each other in most poetic meter, certainly not a poetic meter with an even number of syllables per line, because there are some poetic meters that work in sets of 3 syllables, but that's clearly not the case here. So, no poetic meter. There is a tendency towards keeping lines the same length, though. It's 8 syllables. We've got quite a lot of rhyming going on, but he tends to chop and change the rhyming scheme that he's using quite a lot on the fly, which is interesting. So, I will give this poem another reading, and I will consider whether there's anything more that needs to be researched or discussed. Verse, a breeze mid blossoms straying, where hopes clung feeding like a bee. Both were mine, life went a-maying, with nature, hope, and poesy. When I was young, ah, woeful when, ah, for the change twixt now and then, this breathing house not built with hands, this body that does me grievous wrong. O'er airy cliffs and glittering sands, how lightly then it flashed along, like those trim skiffs, my apologies, like those trim skiffs unknown of yore, on winding lakes and rivers wide, that ask no aid of sail or oar, that fear no spite of wind or tide, naught cared this body for wind or weather, when youth and I lived in it together. Flowers are lovely, love is flower-like, friendship is a sheltering tree. Oh, the joys that came down shower-like, of friendship, love, and liberty. Ere I was old, our woeful air, which tells me youth no longer's here. O you for years so many and sweet, 'tis known that thou and I were one. I'll think it but a fond conceit, it cannot be that thou art gone. Thy vesper bell have not yet tolled, and thou wert I a mask to hold. My apologies. And thou wert I a mask a bold. What strange disguise hast now put on, to make believe that thou art gone? I see these locks in silvery slips, this drooping gait, this altered size, but springtide blossoms on thy lips, and tears take sunshine from thine eyes, and life is but thought, so think I will, that youth and I are housemates still. Dewdrops are the gems of morning, but tears of mournful eve, where no hope is, life's a warning, that only serves to make us grieve, when we are old. That only serves to make us grieve, with often tedious taking leave, like some poor nigh-related guest, that may not rudely be dismissed, yet have outstayed his welcome while, and tells the jest without the smile. So, is there anything that anyone in chat would like to discuss about this poem? Anything they're unclear on? Anything they find interesting but hasn't been discussed yet? Anything like that? I think at this point I'm largely happy with it. Saint says, in reference to a conversation that's been ongoing in chat, yes, I agree. I think we are one big global human family and we should treat each other like we treat family members. Twitch, etc. allows us to connect and learn from each other. What a lovely thought. Thank you for that, Saint. So, it looks like there's nothing more that we want to discuss regarding this one. So, we'll move on to Pride and Prejudice. Now, we're up to chapter 19, so there is quite a lot to recap. So I'll just get on with it. In chapter 1, we met the Bennet family, comprised of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, as well as Jane, the eldest daughter, Elizabeth, the second eldest, followed by Mary, Catherine, also known as Kitty, and Lydia. We also learned that a Mr. Bingley would be moving into Netherfield House, which was a nearby residence, although he was at that time an unknown quantity. In the second chapter, we learn a bit of Mr. Bennet's sense of humour. During those times, it was only appropriate for families to have relations once the men of the house had been introduced to each other, and in particular in a case like this it was customary for the man of the house to visit their new neighbour. Because of this, and because of the fact they understood, that is the family understood Mr. Bingley might be a good match for one of their daughters, the daughters and the mother pressed Mr. Bennet into visiting Mr. Bingley at his earliest convenience. But Mr. Bennet, here showing his sense of humour, did visit Mr. Bingley quite promptly, but didn't tell his family. In chapter 3, we learn more of Mr. Bennet's sense of humour, because even once it became known to his family that Mr. Bennet had visited Mr. Bingley, he refused to provide an adequate description of what Mr. Bingley was like to his wife or daughters. So that vexed them. We also saw that Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit because that's what you did in those days. If someone visited you, then there was an expectation that you would shortly thereafter visit them back. That is how social relations were maintained within those classes within society. And failing to return a visit would be taken as a sign that you wish to end a correspondence. Mr. Bingley, as I say, returned Mr. Bennet's visit by visiting them, although they stayed in Mr. Bennet's study with the rest of the family out of the way, so still nobody got a good look at him besides Mr. Bennet. Then later on in chapter 3, a ball was held. I could be wrong. I don't think we were ever actually told where that ball was, at what residence, but a ball was held, and we met the Hursts. Now the Hursts are Mr. Hurst and his wife Mrs. Hurst, and I believe Mrs. Hurst is one of Mr. Bingley's sisters. I believe Mr. Bingley has two sisters, one who is known as Miss Bingley, and another one that is Mrs. Hurst, because she's married. Now, a point on names. Back in those days, it was customary for the eldest daughter of a family to be Miss Surname, and then the younger daughters to be Miss First Name Surname. So in the Bennet family, Miss Bennet would have to be Jane. There's no other member of the family that could be, because obviously the mother is Mrs. Bennet, and then you'd have Miss Elizabeth Bennet and so on. This is significant because I don't know what the rules would have been once the eldest daughter got married. I have a sneaking suspicion that then the next eldest daughter would have inherited the dropping of the first name. And I say this because I have a vague recollection, I may be mistaken, that Miss Bingley is actually the younger sister and Mrs. Hurst is the elder, but I could be wrong about that. But they are both sisters of Mr. Bennet. Sorry, they are both sisters of Mr. Bingley, I meant to say, who has recently moved into Netherfield House. We also met in this ball Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy chose to sit out of the dance, which is quite an unsociable thing to do. And not because he was sitting out, there weren't enough gentlemen to go about, and as a result, one of the ladies had to sit out. As it happened, at one point, Miss Elizabeth Bennet was sitting out, and when Mr. Bingley went over to Mr. Darcy, his friend, and asked him to join in, because that's a social thing to do, and pointed out that Miss Elizabeth was available to dance with, Mr. Darcy slighted her, claiming that she wasn't attractive enough for him to be interested in dancing with her, and why should he dance with a woman that's clearly been turned down by another gentleman already, which of course isn't what had happened at all. What had happened was that there weren't enough people to go around, because he was sitting out. But he rather slighted her by doing that. I'll see you, Saint. In chapter 4, we see Jane and Elizabeth talking about the difference in character between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. In chapter 5, we're introduced to the Lucas family, who were in fact at the earlier ball, although I don't think it came up. And we learn that Charlotte Lucas is a very close friend of Elizabeth. In chapter 6, we find out that Mr. Darcy is in fact falling in love with Elizabeth, despite having slighted her before. In chapter 7, we find out that Catherine and Lydia Bennet like to travel to visit Miss Phillips in Meryton. Mrs. Phillips, sorry. I believe Mrs. Phillips is a sister of Mrs. Bennet. And we find out or they find out that there are some soldiers recently stationed there, a point that they find very interesting. They seem very interested in the young officers. Jane travels to Netherfield to visit the Bingley family. At this point it becomes apparent that she and Mr. Bingley seem to have some affection for each other. But her mother refuses to allow her to use the carriage. This is by design, because she believes it's going to rain later, and in Mrs. Bennet's mind she thinks, oh, she'll get ill and then have to stay a few nights there, which otherwise would be very much the wrong thing to do for a young woman to stay over the house of a young man's. But she'll fall ill, have to stay there, and then maybe a romance will blossom. And that, in fact, is exactly what happens. She takes the horse, it rains on her, she falls ill, she has to stay at Netherfield. Elizabeth, the next day, walks there and stays the night, because Jane is still not well. In chapter 8, we find out that Elizabeth is being treated as a bit of an odd one out at a Netherfield house, because she walked alone through fields to get there, several miles, which is apparent was something that everyone agreed at Netherfield House was a very silly, careless thing to do. She also prefers reading books instead of playing cards with the others, so she's treated as the odd one out. We also learn a bit of Mr. Darcy's high standards for women, as he talks about what he expects to see in an accomplished young woman. And we find out the apotheker, Mr. Jones, will be sent for in the morning to look at Jane. In chapter 9, Mrs. Bennet visits to see Jane, and despite believing that she is doing okay, claims that she is too ill to move because she wants her to stay there longer. When the apothecary visits, he agrees with her that she shouldn't be moved. We also see discussions between the guests and the hosts at Netherfield House, and Lydia Bennet pressures Mr. Bingley to keep his promise to hold a ball. Lydia was thinking of the soldiery. She was hoping she'd get to meet some of those officers. In chapter 10, we find that Jane is on the mend, and we also see the differences between Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy stressed via an analogy of letter writing. Mr. Darcy's writing a letter, and they get into a discussion about how they and some of the other residents there get into a discussion of how they would approach letter writing differently. Mr. Darcy then tries to dance with Elizabeth, but is refused. This is just in an evening, as part of an evening's entertainment. We also see that whilst going for a walk with Mrs. Hurst, Elizabeth bumps into Miss Bingley and Mr. Darcy, and they end up making a free, with Elizabeth being somewhat voluntarily excluded. In chapter 11, we see that Jane has recovered, and we also see Miss Bingley trying to persuade Mr. Bingley not to hold the ball, which she fails at. We also see Miss Bingley trying to catch Mr. Darcy's attention via a turn about the room and ropes Elizabeth in to join her. This attempt fails. In chapter 12, Elizabeth writes to her mother for the carriage so that they can return home, which is refused as her mother wants Jane to stay longer. We also see many professions of concern from the residents of Netherfield House, and ask them to defer leaving till the following morning, which they do. Mr. Bingley tries to persuade Jane to stay longer, but ultimately relents. And when the sisters do return home after Sunday morning service, the mother is not pleased with them, while their father is very happy to see them. In chapter 13, we find out that a gentleman is visiting. This gentleman is Mr. Collins, who is apparently a cousin of Mr. Bennet, when I say visiting, that's visiting the Bennets. It turns out Mr. Collins is due to inherit Longbourn House, where the Bennets live, after their father dies, so the mother and the daughters would have nowhere to go at that point. We also find out that Mr. Collins has been ordinated. He is a priest. And we find out that he is a patron in Lady Catherine de Bourgh. In chapter 14, at dinner, Mr. Collins is there, and as he's visiting them, and we learn that he lives near his patroness and that she has a sickly daughter, and that we also learn that Mr. Bennet thinks Mr. Collins absurd, although he doesn't say so. He seems to just find it very amusing and keeps it to himself. We also find out that Mr. Collins never reads novels, as he disapproves of them, and Mr. Collins is offended by Lydia interrupting him 3 pages into a book of Thorndyce's sermons, which he's reading out loud to the group. He then offers himself as an antagonist to Mr. Bennet at backgammon, thus sparing the daughters from having to listen to more of his sermons. In chapter 15, it becomes apparent that Mr. Collins intends to marry one of the Bennet daughters. Mrs. Bennet convinces him to change his mind from Jane to Elizabeth, because she believes Jane will be soon to be married to Mr. Bingley, rather optimistically. Mr. Bennet insists that Mr. Collins should join his daughters in a trip to Meryton, so that he can be rid of him, though of course he doesn't say so. Or rather, he doesn't say that he wishes to be rid of him, but he insists that he should join them. There we find Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham meet the party, who are both officers. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley also arrive, coincidentally, around the same time and attempt to speak to the young ladies, but seem a bit off once they see that Mr. Wickham is there. Subsequently, Mr. Wickham is invited to dinner at Mrs. Phillips' house the following evening. In chapter 16, Mr. Wickham explains that the late Mr. Darcy was his godfather and bequeathed him the next presentation of the best living, presumably meaning a parish. The young Mr. Darcy, however, the Mr. Darcy we know, denies it. Notionally, it is put forward as though the will was clear, but not entirely. Its meaning was clear, but not legally scrupulous, and so that it was possible for Mr. Darcy to challenge it, in spite of the late Mr. Darcy's intentions. That is how Mr. Wickham presents it. We also learn that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy are sisters, and it is believed that Mr. Darcy will marry Miss de Bourgh, his cousin, to unite the two families. In chapter 17, we find out that Jane cannot believe Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and tries to be diplomatic about the matter, trying to find an interpretation of the events where neither of the two are seen in a bad light. We also see Mr. Bingley and his sisters. Mr. Bingley and his sisters come to visit the Bennets, specifically to give their personal invitation to the long-awaited ball at Netherfield, although they largely ignore everyone but Jane. Elizabeth discovers that Mr. Collins will accept the invitation also, and moreover asks her for the first 2 dances, which she cannot reasonably refuse, although she had hoped to have those dances with Mr. Wickham. In chapter 18, we find out that Mr. Wickham is not present at the ball, as he had gone to town on business and seems to have lingered. Elizabeth detests the first 2 dances with Mr. Collins, him being awkward and solemn. She also accidentally accepts a dance with Mr. Darcy, leading to a little verbal swordplay followed by long periods of silence. Miss Bingley accosts Elizabeth over Mr. Wickham, because of course Mr. Wickham doesn't portray Mr. Darcy in a very nice light, and Miss Bingley rather fancies Mr. Darcy. Also, through gossiping, Jane reveals that it's the possibility that Mr. Wickham's inheritance was actually only conditional. And that might be the real issue at play here. Mr. Collins obliviously embarrasses himself in front of Mr. Darcy, contrary to Elizabeth's entreaties not to approach him. Several of the members of the Bennet family then embarrass themselves in Elizabeth's eyes, including Mrs. Bennet's loud gossiping and Mary's singing. By a manoeuvre of Mrs. Bennet, the family then have to wait an additional 15 minutes for their carriage to arrive before they can leave. So that is as far as we have got. So, chapter 19. The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins made his declaration in form, having resolved to do it without loss of time. As his leave of absence extended only to the following Saturday, and having no feelings of diffidence to make it distressing to himself even at the moment, he set about it in a very orderly manner, and with all the observances which he supposed a regular part of the business. On finding Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together, soon after breakfast, he addressed the mother in these words: "May I hope, madam, for your interest with your fair daughter Elizabeth, when I solicit for the honour of private audience with her in the course of this morning." Before Elizabeth had time for anything but a blush of surprise, Mrs. Bennet answered instantly, "Oh dear, yes, certainly. I'm sure Lizzie will be very happy. I'm sure she can have no objection. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs." And gathering her work together, she was hastening away when Elizabeth called out, "Dear madam, do not go. I beg you will not go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear. I am going away myself." "No, no, nonsense, Lizzie. I desire you to stay where you are." And upon Elizabeth seeming really, with vexed and embarrassed looks, about to escape, she added, "Lizzie, I insist upon your staying and hearing Mr. Collins." Elizabeth would not oppose such an injunction, and a moment's consideration making her also sensible that it would be wisest to get it over as soon and as quietly as possible, she sat down again and tried to conceal by incessant employment the feelings which were divided between distress and aversion. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty walked off, and as soon as they were gone, Mr. Collins began: "Believe me, my dear Elizabeth, that your modesty, so far from doing you any disservice, rather adds to your other perfections. You would have been less amiable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to... let me repeat that. You would not have been less amiable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to assure you that I have your respected mother's permission for this address. You can hardly doubt the purport of my discourse. However, your natural delicacy may lead you to dissemble. However, your natural delicacy may lead you to dissemble. My attentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. But before I am run away with by my feelings on this subject, perhaps it would be advisable for me to state my reasons for marrying, and moreover for coming into Hertfordshire with the design of selecting a wife, as I certainly did." The idea of Mr. Collins, with his solemn composure, being run away with by his feelings, made Elizabeth so near laughing that she could not use the short pause he allowed in any attempt to stop him further, and he continued: "My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman in every circumstance like myself to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced that it will add very greatly to my happiness, and thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that is the particular advice and recommendation of a very noble lady whom I have the honour of calling patroness. Twice has she condescended to give me her opinion, unasked too, on this subject, and it was but the very Saturday night before I left Hunsford, between our pools at Cadril, while Mrs. Jenkinson was arranging Mr. Burr's footstool, that she said, 'Mr. Collins, you must marry. A clergyman like you must marry. Choose properly, choose a gentlewoman for my sake, and for your own sake. Oh, and for your own. Let her be an active, useful sort of person, not brought up high, but able to make a small income go a good way. This is my advice. Find such a woman as soon as you can. Bring her to Hunsford, and I will visit her. Allow me, by the way, to observe, my fair cousin, that I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh among the least of the advantages in my power to offer. You will find her manners beyond anything I can describe, and your wit and vivacity, I think, must be acceptable to her, especially when tempered with the silence and respect which her rank will inevitably excite. Thus much for my general intention in favour of matrimony. It remains to be told why my views were directed towards Longbourn instead of my own neighbourhood, where I can assure you there are many amiable young women. But the fact is that being as I am to inherit this estate after the death of your honoured father, who however may live many years longer, I could not satisfy myself without resolving to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss to them might be as little as possible. When the melancholy event takes place, which, however, as I've already said, may not be for several years, which, as I've already said, may not be for several years. This has been my motive, my fair cousin, and I flatter myself it will not sink me in your esteem. And now nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. To fortune I am perfectly indifferent, and shall make no demand of that nature on your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with, and that £1,000 in the 4%, I'm well aware it could not be complied with, and that £1,000 in the 4%, which will not be yours till after your mother's decease, is all that you may ever be entitled to. I don't follow that, unfortunately. To fortune I am perfectly indifferent, and shall make no demand of that nature on your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with, so calling them poor, I think, and that £1,000 in the 4%, which will not be yours till after your mother's decease, is all that you may ever be entitled to. Okay. I'm not sure what in the 4% means, but I think he's talking about the fact that they're poor and that she doesn't have much inheritance. And that doesn't bother him. On that head, therefore, I shall be uniformly silent, and you may assure yourself that no ungenerous reproach shall ever pass my lips when we are married. It was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. You are too hasty, sir, she cried. You forgot that I have made no answer. Let me do it without further loss of time. Accept my thanks for the compliment you are paying me. I am very sensible of the honour of your proposals, but it is impossible for me to do otherwise than to decline them. I'm not now to learn, replied Mr. Collins with a formal wave of the hand, that it is usual with young ladies to reject the addresses of men whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favour, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long. Upon my word, sir, cried Elizabeth, your hope is a rather extraordinary one after my declaration. I do assure you that I am not one of those young ladies, if such young ladies there are, who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy. I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so. Nay, were your friend Lady Catherine to know me, I am persuaded she would find me in every respect ill qualified for the situation. Were it certain that Lady Catherine would think so, said Mr. Collins very gravely, but I cannot imagine that her ladyship would at all disapprove of you. You may be certain when I have the honour of seeing her again, I shall speak in the very highest terms of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualifications. Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. You must give me leave to judge for myself, and pay me the compliment of believing what I say. I wish you very happy and very rich, and by refusing your hand, do all in my power to prevent your being otherwise. In making me the offer, you must have satisfied the delicacy of your feelings. With regard to my family, I may take possession of Longbourn estate wherever it falls without my self-reproach. This matter may be considered, therefore, as finally settled. And rising as she thus spoke, she would have quitted the room had Mr. Collins not thus addressed her. When I do myself the honour of speaking to you next on the subject, I shall hope to receive a more favourable answer than you have now given me, though I am far from accusing you of cruelty at present, because I know it to be the established custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application, and perhaps you have even now said as much to encourage my suit as would be consistent with the true delicacy of the female character. Really, Mr. Collins, cried Elizabeth with some warmth, you puzzle me exceedingly. If what I have hitherto said can appear to you in the form of encouragement, I know not how to express my refusal in such a way as to convince you of it being one. You must give me leave to flatter myself, my dear cousin, that your refusal of my addresses is merely words of course. My reasons for believing it are briefly these. It does not appear to me that my hand is unworthy of your acceptance, or that the establishment I can offer would be any other than highly desirable. My situation in life, my connections with the family of de Bourgh, and my relationship to your own, are circumstances highly in my favour, and you should not take it into further considerations that in spite of your manifold attractions, it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made you. Your portion is unhappily so small that it in all likelihood undo the effects of your loveliness and amiable qualifications. As I must therefore conclude that you are not serious in your rejection of me, I shall choose to attribute it to your wish of increasing my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females. I do assure you, sir, that I have no pretensions whatever to that kind of elegance which consists in tormenting a respectable man. I would rather be paid the compliment of being believed sincere. I thank you again and again for the honour you have done me in your proposals, but to accept them is absolutely impossible. My feelings in every respect forbid it. Can I speak plainer? Do not consider me now as an elegant female intending to plague you, but as a rational creature speaking the truth from her heart. You are uniformly charming, cried he, with an air of awkward gallantry. I am persuaded that when sanctioned by the express authority of both your excellent parents, my proposal will not fail of being acceptable. To such perseverance, in wilful self-deception, Elizabeth would make no reply, and immediately and in silence withdrew, determined, if he persisted in considering her repeated refusals as flattering encouragement, to apply to her father, whose negative might be uttered in such a manner as to be decisive, and whose behaviour at least could not be mistaken for the affection and coquetry of an elegant female. So, Chapter 20. Mr. Collins was not left to the long, silent contemplation of his successful love, for Mrs. Bennet, having dawdled about in the vestibule to watch for the end of the conference, no sooner saw Elizabeth open the door, and with a quick step passed her towards the staircase, than she entered the breakfast room and congratulated both him and herself in warm terms on the happy prospect of their nearer connection. Mr. Collins received and returned these felicitations with equal pleasure, and then proceeded to relate the particulars of their interview, the result of which he trusted he had every reason to be satisfied, since the refusal which his cousin had steadfastly given him would naturally flow from her bashful modesty and the genuine delicacy of her character. This information, however, startled Mrs. Bennet. She would have been glad to be equally satisfied that her daughter had meant to encourage him by protesting against his proposals, but she dared not believe it, and could not help saying so. But depend upon it, Mr. Collins, she added, that Lizzie shall be brought to reason. I will speak to her about it directly. She is very headstrong, foolish girl, and does not know her own interest, but I will make her know it. Pardon me for interrupting you, madam, cried Mr. Collins. If she is really headstrong and foolish, I know not whether she would altogether be a very desirable wife to a man in my situation, who naturally looks for happiness in the marriage state. If therefore she actually persists in rejecting my suit, perhaps it were better not to force her into accepting me, because if liable to such effects of temper, she could not contribute much to my felicity. Sir, you quite misunderstand me, said Mrs. Bennet, alarmed. Lizzie is only headstrong in such matters as these. In everything else she is as good-natured a girl as ever lived. I will go directly to Mr. Bennet, and we shall very soon settle it with her, I am sure. She would not give him time to reply, but hurrying instantly to her husband, called out as she entered the library, "Oh, Mr. Bennet! You are wanted immediately. We are all in an uproar. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him. And if you do not make haste, he will change his mind and not have her. Mr. Bennet raised his eyes from his book as she entered, and fixed them on her with a calm unconcern which was not in the least altered by her communication. "I have not the pleasure of understanding you," said he, when she had finished her speech. "Of what are you talking?" "Oh, Mr. Collins and Lizzie. Lizzie declares she will not have Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins begins to say he will not have Lizzie. And what I am to do on the occasion? It seems a hopeless business. Speak to Lizzie about yourself. Tell her that you insist upon her marrying him. Let her be cooled down. She shall hear my opinion." Mr. Bennet rang the bell, and Miss Elizabeth was summoned to the library. "Come here, child," cried her father as she appeared. "I have sent for you on an affair of importance. I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is it true?" Elizabeth replied that it was. "Very well. And this offer of marriage you have refused?" "I have, sir." "Very well. We now come to the point. Your mother insists upon your accepting it. Is it not so, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, I will never see her again." Yes, or I will never see her again. "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Elizabeth could not but smile at such a conclusion of such a beginning, but Mrs. Bennet, who had persuaded herself that her husband regarded the affair as she wished, was excessively disappointed. "What do you mean, Mr. Bennet, in talking this way? You promised me to insist upon her marrying him." "My dear," replied her husband, "I have two small favours to request. First, it will allow me the free use of my understanding on the present occasion, and secondly, of my room. I shall be glad to have the library to myself as soon as may be." Not yet, however, in spite of her disappointment in her husband, did Mrs. Bennet give up the point. She talked to Elizabeth again and again, coaxed and threatened her by turns. She endeavoured to secure Jane in her interest, but Jane, with all possible mildness, declined interfering, and Elizabeth, sometimes with real earnestness, and sometimes with playful gaiety, replied to her attacks. Though her manner varied, however, her determination never did. Mr. Collins, meanwhile, was meditating in solitude on what had passed. He thought too well of himself to comprehend on what motives his cousin could refuse him, and though his pride was hurt, he suffered in no other way. His regard for her was quite imaginary, and the possibility of her deserving her mother's reproach prevented his feeling any regret. While the family were in this confusion, Charlotte Lucas came to spend the day with them. She was met in the vestibule by Lydia, who, flying to her, cried in a half-whisper, "I'm glad you are come, for there is such fun here. What do you think has happened this morning? Mr. Collins has made an offer to Lizzie, and she will not have him." Charlotte hardly had time to answer before they were joined by Kitty, who came to tell the same news, and no sooner had they entered the breakfast-room, where Mrs. Bennet was alone, than she likewise began on the subject, calling on Miss Lucas for her compassion, and entreating her to persuade her friend Lizzie to comply with the wishes of all her family. "Pray do, my dear Miss Lucas," she added in a melancholy tone, "for nobody is on my side, nobody takes part with me. I'm cruelly used, nobody feels for my poor nerves." Charlotte's reply was spared by the entrance of Jane and Elizabeth. "Aye, there she comes," continued Mrs. Bennet, "looking as unconcerned as may be, caring no more for us than if we were at York, provided she can have her own way. But I tell you, Miss Lizzie, if you take it into your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all, and I am sure I do not know who is to maintain you when your father is dead. I shall not be able to keep you, and so I warn you. I have done with you from this very day. I told you in the library, you know, that I should never speak to you again. I will not find as good, and you will find me as good as my word. I have no pleasure in talking to undutiful children. Not that I have much pleasure, indeed, in talking to anybody. People who suffer as I do from nervous complaint can have no great inclination for talking. Nobody can tell what I suffer. but it is always so. Those who do not complain are never pitied. Her daughters listened in silence to this effusion, sensible that any attempt to reason with her or soothe her would only increase the irritation. She talked on, therefore, without interruption from any of them, till they were joined by Mr. Collins, who entered the room with an air more stately than usual, and on perceiving whom, she said to the girls, "Now I do insist upon it that you, all of you, hold your tongues and let me and Mr. Collins have a little conversation together." Elizabeth passed quietly out of the room. Jane and Kitty followed, but Lydia stood her ground, determined to hear all she could, and Charlotte, detained first by the civility of Mr. Collins, who inquired after herself and all her family were very minute, whose inquiries after herself and all her family were very minute, and then by a little curiosity, satisfied herself with walking to the window and pretending not to... Excuse me, sorry about that. And Charlotte, detained first by the civility of Mr. Collins, whose inquiries after herself and all her family were very minute, and then by a little curiosity, satisfied herself with walking to the window and pretending not to hear. In a doleful voice, Mrs. Bennet began the projected conversation. "Oh, Mr. Collins, my dear madam," replied he, "let us be for ever silent on this point. Far be it from me," he presently continued in a voice that marked his displeasure, "to resent the behaviour of your daughter. Resignation to inevitable evils is the duty of us all, the peculiar duty of a young man who has been so fortunate as I have been in every preferment, and I trust I am resigned, perhaps not the less so from feeling a doubt of my positive happiness had my fair cousin honoured me with a hand, for I've often observed that resignation is never so perfect as when the blessing denied begins to lose somewhat of its value in our estimation. You will not, I hope, consider me as showing any disrespect to your family, my dear madam, by thus withdrawing my pretensions to your daughter's favour, without having paid yourself and Mr. Bennet the compliment of requesting you to interpose your authority in my behalf. My conduct may, I fear, be objectionable in having accepted my dismission from your daughter's lips instead of your own. We are all liable to error. I have certainly meant well through the whole affair. My object has been to secure an amiable companion for myself, with due consideration for the advantages to all your family, and if my manner has been at all reprehensible, I here beg leave to apologise. So, I think we'll leave Pride and Prejudice off there. Is there anything we'd like to discuss about what we have read of Pride and Prejudice tonight before I move on? I assume not. Okay, then we will move on to riddles. So I think the last one the last riddle we looked at was 47. So we'll start by rereading that one. Let it be known, I boast celestial birth, though oft I fix my residence on earth. In paradise I once was known to dwell, ere the first pair by disobedience fell. But when the horrors of their guilt they knew, from the sad spot precipitate I flew. Once by a virtuous prince I was possessed, and lift the sovereign of his breast. But now, alas, at courts I'm seldom found. My direst foes usurp that sinful ground. Like Noah's dove, I range the world's vast space, alike perplexed to find a resting place. My sex is feminine, or poet's fame. I wear a placid and engaging mien. I'm gentle, mild, benevolent, sincere, and where I dwell diffusive smiles appear. All vice I hate and malice I despise. I never am found but with the good and wise. Take one hint more that may my name disclose. I heighten joys and soften human woes. Now I must confess, despite that being the last poem we left off on, at least I believe it was, I've actually forgotten the solution to this one. I've got a feeling it was something like reason, but I could be wrong. Well, I'm really quite confident we did do that one, so I will just look up the solution for 47 now, and then we'll move on. Nope, I didn't want to be this far down. Innocence. Of course, that makes sense. Let it be known, I boast celestial birth, though oft I fix my residence on earth. In paradise I once was known to dwell, ere the first pair by disobedience fell. But when the horrors of their guilt they knew, from the sad spot precipitate I flew. And once by a virtuous, the disobedience of course being eating the forbidden fruit, which led to them having knowledge of good and evil, at which point they were no longer innocent. Once by a virtuous prince I was possessed, and left the sovereign of his breast. But now, alas, at courts I'm seldom found. My direst foes usurp that sinful ground. Like Noah's dove I range the world's vast space, alike perplexed to find a resting place. My sex is feminine, or poet's fame, or a placid and engaging mien. I'm gentle, mild, benevolent, sincere, and where I dwell diffusive smiles appear. All vice I hate and malice I despise, and never am found but with the good and wise. To take one hint more that may my name disclose, I heighten joys and soften human woes. Innocence. So that was the last one we did. So let's take a look at 48. Ye riddling bards, explore my name, and to the ladies show it, for they by me acquire much fame, and therefore ought to know it. My form's round, oval, long or square, as different are my prices, and I am always near the fair, when first the charmer rises. To church and playhouse I attend, in a snug place secure, when beaux or belles I there befriend, I'm found in miniature. Me the old maid who wants a spouse, oft views with great regard, I'm found in almost every house, and often broke, though hard. I can't be certain, but I'm wondering if it's a particular piece of makeup, like lipstick. I don't know when. I don't know how old lipstick is, though. I mean, I have no doubt people have been painting their lips for millennia, but an actual lipstick as we would recognise it today, I don't know. So, ye riddling bards explore my name, and to the ladies show it, for they by me acquire much fame, and therefore ought to know it. My form's round, oval, long or square, as different are my prices, and I am always near the fair when first the charmer rises. To church and playhouse I attend, in snug place secure, when bows or bells I there befriend, I'm found in miniature. Me, the old maid who wants a spouse, oft views with great regard, I'm found in almost every house, and often broke though hard. I'm guessing lipstick. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm wrong, because it may not have existed at that point. I would be surprised if it wasn't some item of makeup, though. Jenny thinks it might be a mirror. You riddling bards explore my name, and to the ladies show it, for they by me acquire much fame, and therefore ought to know it. My form's round, oval, long or square, as different are my prices. I am always near the fair when first the charmer rises. To church and playhouse I attend, in a snug place secure, when bows or bells I there befriend, I'm found in miniature. Me, the old maid who wants a spouse, oft views with great regard, I'm found in almost every house, and often broke though hard. That's also possible. I could believe that. Jenny says lipstick is not round. Well, the tip of it should be. As I understand it anyway. It depends which side you're talking about, but it wouldn't be square. I wouldn't have thought. So yes, I think you're more likely to be right with your guess of a mirror. So, 48. Mirror, you were correct. Well done, Jenny. "49. When first presented to the world, I'm innocent and fair, but catch the vices of the age before I've long been there. While new my face I'm sure to please, but short-lived is my sway, for scarce I'm won, ever fickle man cast me with scorn away, not satisfied with quitting me, to aggravate my shame, when he's obtained all I can yield, he gives me a bad name. In vice, in virtue, folly, sense, in wit too I'm abound, in short in my variety of every sort is found. Art, science, war, Parnassian briefs. Parnassian. Now that's an interesting word. Relating to Parnassus, a source of literary, especially poetic inspiration, and so belonging to poetry, poetic. Oh, of course. Yeah, that makes sense. Of Parnassian reefs, lore and divinity. Actors, wits, beauties often owe to me celebrity. I'm found in almost every land, in Britain well I'm known. A welcome guest where I go, I visit even the throne. Wealth, fame and honour I dispense, and sometimes cause disgrace. To dismal prisons some I send, to others give a place. And life and death, to either hand, these give and take away. A proof of this most men receive on each returning day. But though thus gifted, I, alas, man's fatal victim prove, destroyed as oft the case by him who once professed to love. Ooh. Well, this is an interesting one, isn't it? When first presented to the world, I'm innocent and fair, but catch the vices of the age before I've long been there. While new my face, I'm sure to please, but short-lived is my sway, for scarce I'm one ever fickle man cast me with scorn away, not satisfied with quitting me, to aggravate my shame. When he obtained all I can yield, he gives me a bad name. In vice, in virtue, folly, sense, in wit too I abound. In short, in me variety of every sort is found. Art, science, war, Parnassian reefs, law and divinity, actors, wits, beauties often owe to me celebrity. I'm found in almost every land, in Britain well I'm known, a welcome guest wherever I go, I visit even the throne. Wealth, fame, and honour I dispense, and sometimes cause disgrace. To dismal prisons some I send, to others give a place, and life and death to either hand. To these give and take away, a proof of this most men receive on each returning day. But though thus gifted, I alas, man's fatal victim prove, destroyed as oft the case by him who once professed to love. Jenny says a newspaper. When first presented to the world, I'm innocent and fair, but catch the vices of the age before I've long been there. Ooh. If that were a newspaper, that's quite an astute observation, if true. While new my face, I'm sure to please, but short-lived is my sway, for scarce I've one ever fickle man cast me with scorn away. Not satisfied with quitting me, to aggravate my shame, when he's obtained all I can yield, he gives me a bad name. In vice, in virtue, folly, sense, in wit too I abound, in short, in me variety of every sort is found. Art, science, war, Parnassian reefs, law and divinity, actors, wit's beauties often owe to me celebrity. I'm found in almost every land, in Britain well I'm known, a welcome guest wherever I go, I visit even the throne. Wealth, fame, and honour I dispense, and sometimes cause disgrace. To dismal prisons some I send, to others give a place, and life and death too either hand. These give and take away. A proof of this most men receive on each returning day. But though thus gifted, I alas, man's fatal victim prove, destroyed as oft the case by him who once professed to love. I do like the idea of it being a newspaper. I'm not sure absolutely all of it makes sense, like, for example, destroyed as oft the case by him who once professed to love. But a lot of it does make sense as a newspaper, especially if you think of its inception as being when the newspaper is founded. If you have a culture in which people are off, it's quite a common thing for someone to think they're going to set up their own newspaper. Because of course this would have been well before national newspapers, as far as I'm aware. There would have been hundreds of newspapers, probably thousands, up and down the country. Because, you wouldn't have had the ability to distribute newspapers well throughout the country, and even if you could, each area would have had its own dialect and own interests. So for that reason, this would have been a period in which there would have been a lot of local newspapers, so you could believe that people might casually set up a newspaper, and I could see how one might... It may be a recurring theme that someone sets up a newspaper, it gets a lot of attention, people are saying how great it is, then people fall out of love with it, and it seems to give in to all the vices of the age. That makes sense. It's a really nice interpretation. I'm just not quite 100% sold. I'm gonna actually I can't think of a better guess, so I'm gonna assume that's it and look it up. I do hope it is. We're up to 49, isn't it? It is a newspaper. Well done, Jenny. I really like that one. I don't think I would have guessed that one on my own. Also interesting the subjects that they seem to cover. Art, science, war, Parnassian reefs, law and divinity. That's really interesting because you don't really get that range of subjects in today's newspapers, I'd suggest. 50. Ere Adam was my being first began, pure and unspotted till defiled by man. But stop, I ask, that sex is pardoned first. 'Tis said that woman's faults made me accursed, and yet such love I bear to humankind, their choicest blessings are through me consigned, relief from pain, and balms for every ill. Nor is this all. I other gifts add still, gold, silver, precious gems, they all are mine, which to their use I willingly resign, and in return the only thing I ask is that they tell my name, an easy task. Jenny said the earth. The second half of the riddle certainly makes sense if it's the earth. And if we interpret the first line as here Adam was, my being first began, as meaning it predates Adam, that would make sense. Although I interpreted it as the subjects being began during Adam. Here Adam was, my being first began. I suppose that 'tis said that women's fault made me a curse could be a reference to the eating of the forbidden fruit and then being chucked out of the Garden of Eden. The only problem with that is that I don't think it was ever an interpretation of that passage of the Bible that God actually made the rest of the world. I don't think it's an interpretation that the whole world was the Garden of Eden and then God made it worse in retaliation for eating of the forbidden fruit. I believe the interpretation was that it was a physical location that they were kicked out of. Still, we'll see if you're right, Jenny, even though I'm not entirely sold. It is in fact the Earth. I don't fully get it, but there we are. Okay, 51. Insensible as clay, deaf, dumb and blind, I yet possess each passion of the mind. Rage, tenderness, grief, joy, soft hope and fear dwell in my breast and in my words appear. Not only I possess but can impart each sentiment that ever touched the heart. At the same time, by the same means bestow the height of pleasure and abyss of woe. Some at my sight you'll see with horror start, while others fondly press me to their heart. The band of friendship and the source of strife, sometimes the comfort, then the curse of life. In foreign climes I often seem to roam, yet none so strange, but there I find a home. Though in aught else their notions disagree, in this they all unite, they're fond of me. But though the object of their strong desire, ungrateful man oft dooms me to the fire. In different climes a different dress I wear, in France with garlands graced I oft appear, in England black and gold my sides adorn, and robes that rival the fair flocks just shorn. Sometimes as soon as I am born I die, sometimes for centuries I death defy. Like man, if good, my merits have this fate, my spirit they to other realms translate. Wow. This is quite the one, isn't it? I think it could be writing. Of course, they may have picked another word like literature. There's nothing here that makes me think it's more specific, like, say, poetry. So I'm guessing writing. The only bit that I don't follow is in different climes, a different dress I wear. In France with garlands grace I oft appear. In England black and gold my sides adorn, and robes that rifle the fair flocks just shorn. I don't understand that bit in connection with it possibly being writing. But the rest of it would all make sense, I think. Jenny said a letter. It could be a letter. If so, I wonder if it's these 4 lines which are supposed to disambiguate. Maybe it's those 4 lines that make it clear it's supposed to be a letter and not just writing. But if that's the case, then I don't understand the references. Oops, I went too far again. A letter. Uh, 52. 4 men once sat down in a tavern to play. They played all the night and part of the day. Though none of them betted, no stake was put down. Each found when he rose he was a winner a crown. I wonder why it's 4 men specifically. They were musicians. Yep, that was it. Oh, that was a good one. Though I may be biased because I got it right. So, we'll stop there then. Thank you for coming, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the stream. I'll be streaming, I guess, again on Friday, in which I'll be playing some more Black Skylands, and I'll probably also do a Saturday stream. I'll also be doing a Monday stream, which will be my normal adventure stream, in which I'll be doing some more Monkey Island 3, The Curse of Monkey Island, and then back around to Wednesday again, it will be the poetry, prose and riddle stream. I think we will raid... who shall we raid? We'll raid Tofu Rabbit again, I think. So, thank you for coming. I hope you have a lovely night.